Hi everyone, Liberos here, and welcome back to the show. I'm so happy to bring to you today's episode as I'm joined by my good friend, my fellow Mind Valley friends, Rohan Vijay, as we dive into the topics of mitochondria, permaculture, and explore the food landscape. Rohan is someone who I believe is a deep thinker, and we explore so many fascinating concepts in this episode. I'm really looking forward to actually diving into permaculture and sharing what permaculture is with you, because this has a major effect on our food landscape. And I would implore you to dive more into what permaculture is after this episode. But Rohan gives us a fascinating first step into permaculture, first insight into permaculture, and shares with us everything that he's learned about what permaculture actually is. So, without further ado, let's dive into my conversation with Rohan and explore mitochondrial health, permaculture, and the food landscape. Rohan, welcome to Raising Consciousness. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Luke. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for asking. I was thinking beforehand, before we started the episode and when we were chatting before, I believe you are my first guest, my first returning guest, because we recorded an episode. I think can't remember what episode it is off the top of my head. Maybe in the 30s, maybe 20. No, in the 30s, I think. Anyway, I'll link it in the show notes for people if they want to check that one out, where we spoke about. I named the episode around the Vishen Lakhiani book, The Buddha and the Badass. I don't know if you remember that. Remember our conversation and also remember the book. Personally, I love the book. But yeah, you are my first returning guest, so thank you so much for coming back onto the podcast.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here, and thank you for having me again.
No problem. My pleasure. Whenever we talk on the phone or on whatever platform we're using, these days is WhatsApp, isn't it? I always leave in deep thought. So hopefully our viewers and our listeners and our watchers and however people are tuning into this episode will also feel the same and leave the same in deep thought that usually ends in some sort of personal growth, so I always love talking with you, my friend. Today's conversation is different than the one we've done beforehand, but yeah, if people want to check out that episode, as I said, I will link that down below. We're going to be focusing on sharing actually our own health journeys a bit, and how we're navigating the field of health and personal growth and self-transformation, etc., because there is a lot of advice and wisdom out there, which is great, and a lot of information out there, but sometimes it can be a bit overwhelming. So with that in mind, like, the first question I would love to pose to you is, what are you currently fascinated by? Like, what are you currently learning about, studying? If it's in the fields of health, if it's in the fields of just like self-improvement in general, where are you spending most of your time, and why, I guess?
That's a beautiful question to start with. So I'm naturally someone who's predisposed to, like jumping from different fields and trying to bring forth a holistic perspective on everything I have learned. So there are these moments where, like I think the first time we had a conversation, it was when we were both on the Mind Valley platform and we were doing a lot of quests over there. So it was a lot more to deal with consciousness, uh, like mindset, subconscious mind, how our beliefs, like turn out in determining our behavior and all of these aspects. So I spent quite a lot of time studying that, and that was what our first conversation was also about. Lately, I've been more focused on health. So health is one of the aspects that I have always been into, but right now I'm doing a sort of like a much deeper study into nutrition and the human body, and trying to work my way around, like improving my relationship with food, understanding things like intermittent fasting. I've been vegan for the past 3 or 4 years. So I've been, like trying to navigate how to optimize my nutritional intake while staying vegan. I've also been doing, gotten more serious about my workout in terms of resistance training and cardio workouts. So trying to optimize that. So overall, looking into health, looking into the relationship between food and human health. And in last year or so, I've also been interested in this field called permaculture, which has to do with alternative agriculture or regenerative farming. So ways in which we can grow food, which are a lot inspired from the ancient ways in which we used to, like relate to the forest and farm produce for human consumption, and drawing some links between soil health, forest ecosystems, and like what helps planetary ecosystems thrive, and correlating that with the human body, and especially the gut microbiome, because the soil and the gut are both like handled by these mysterious microbes. So we can't see them directly, but they have such an important role to play in almost everything in terms of how we feel, the kind of thoughts we have, the way our metabolism functions within our body and outside our body, the health of plants, the health of the ecosystem that's there. So if we look at the forest, it's like the microbes are the invisible orchestrators of life in the forest. So I've been fascinated by that, and just fascinated by the whole area of human health, nutrition, and forest.
Amazing stuff. And how do you navigate that? Because I can kind of alluded to it beforehand. I have mentioned it a few times in a few episodes, shared on social, that there is so much often conflicting advice and information out there, and especially in the field of health, it can be a bit confusing on what's best for. Like some people might say, "Oh, it depends on your goal," but I think, like in some level, all of our goal is to is if I sum it up in like one word, which is longevity, right? And I define that by living life for a long time at a high level, right? Like some people might,
Mm.
be in a period of their life where they're focusing on, if we're looking at physical health, putting on muscle, or some people might need to lose some weight, drop some pounds, etc. But on some consensus kind of level, where especially when we're consciously pursuing health and stuff, it's about longevity on in some level, like living longer
Mm.
at a high quality level, etc. So kind of like I'm fascinated by how you would love to dive into this from your experience, because there is so much conflicting health advice out there, how you navigate that, and if you actually agree that that's kind of also your pursuit as well, to live life for a long time at a high level, and like with that
Mhm.
mind, yeah, how do you navigate this space?
I'm pretty sure anyone who has been on the internet post-COVID, um, like post-COVID, I mentioned that because that's the time when the whole focus has shifted from diseases to health and longevity, and people trying to optimize on various scales. For some people, it's on, like the smaller scale of their own lives and trying to make better choices so that they don't fall sick. And there are also, like people like Brian Johnson who want to spend millions of dollars into optimizing every single bit of his organs and cells for longevity. So a lot of focus has, like I'm pretty sure longevity, nutrition, biohacking has had a lot of focus from a long time, but the public interest has really grown since COVID, because people started to question the traditional system of medicine a lot more, and the whole like landscape was very chaotic, which also led people to explore more alternative means of healing themselves. So my journey also is somewhat correlated to that. COVID was the time when like it was like the wake up call for me to pay attention to nutrition and health. And I think as a family, like my mom first started to dive deep into this field of nutrition, and slowly that like spread to all of us, and every one of us were more interested in like drinking green tea for antioxidants and eating the right kind of food, having more veggies in our diet, just focus more on food as a tool to heal ourselves and keep ourselves in an optimal state. Whereas the old paradigm was to, like just be mindless about food, eat junk food, drink soda, and like just not be bothered by all the sugar or anything that might have been present in the foods. So I think I was, like that whole public trend that gravitated towards health also influenced me in looking for ways to optimize my own diet in that landscape. And I think it was during that same period when I was a vegetarian. So I used to consume dairy products like milk, cheese, and all of that. Uh, and that was the, like time, like I think during the COVID lockdowns is when I wanted to turn vegan. So and the reason I wanted to turn vegan was because I was having a lot of digestive issues and I wasn't sure what was the reason for it. And I just tried eliminating lactose, so all dairy products, and it seemed to really improve my health. So after that, like I went deeper into vegan nutrition, like how to get all the adequate nutrients met, how to get my protein, B12, and all of these things. And again, it wasn't an overnight thing. It's been an ongoing journey since then. So health is not this one system that, like someone provides and you just follow that and everything goes fine. Like it's rarely like that. It's more like a transformation that happens when you're just interested in learning more about yourself, your own body, and learning more about the world around you and the interplay between your body and the world. So most of what we consider as health, I think, is in that aspect of boundary between what we let into ourselves from the world and what we choose to restrict. And one of the things that I also started to understand was that health isn't necessarily just about taking in the right stuff. It's also about leaving out the things that do a lot of damage. So processed foods, high sugary drinks, like not understanding the, like the effect of any kind of toxins or harmful chemicals and colorings that might be there in processed food. Like all of these things, I started to understand that these are things that I have to leave out and also focus on, like the things that I have to let in. And this interplay of, like trying to understand food sort of led me towards exploring this field of permaculture. So I've always been interested in environment, like doing good for the environment, saving the climate, like minimizing waste and all of these things. But when it came from the perspective of, like improving my own health, I started to understand the environmental factors and the depth and the wisdom of, like the way people used to relate to food in a very different light. So that's where this interplay started, where I became focused on my own health and on what I feed myself and how things are grown. And coming to the landscape of how I navigate this, I think I'm quite fortunate that before I went, like deep into this aspect of health and nutrition alone, the primary thing was to bring forth or understand this aspect of consciousness and becoming more present in my day-to-day life. So I think, like we have spoken in depth about that in our first episode, as well as so many of the experiments that we used to do. So we did a bunch of the silver ultramine case workings, and even that's there on YouTube. So all of those were sort of focused more on, like improving your own intuitive senses, improving your ability to sort of have a deeper sense of going beyond your own thoughts and uh, like having a deeper sense of feeling of what's right and what's not right, and trying to work on that and refine that better. So I think doing that in the beginning and working on, like stabilizing my own emotions, dealing with like the difficulties from my past and all of those things really helped me anchor myself in the present moment. And it helped me, like that became like the anchor through which I could decide what's right and what's not. So it was sort of like this gut feeling that I would have whenever, like I came across any information on the web where I was like, should I try this? Should I not try this? And whenever I was in doubt, like I would be willing to experiment with myself. So I would try out different kinds of diets, try out different kinds of things. So for a while, I used to do only 2 meals a day, and for a couple of times, I attempted only, like going for 1 meal a day. But none of these things were done in a mindset of saying someone else told this is good, so I'll do it. It was always from a perspective of saying, okay, this is a new strategy someone is trying and it has worked for them. What effect will this have on my body? And then, like I become curious about that. I test something out and I keep observing how I feel. I observe what my energy level is like. I observe what my, like exercise and output is like during my physical activities. I keep track of, like what my mood is like. So all of these things are something, like the aspect of introspection was already dominant. So I could play around, like tweak things with food. And even now, most of what I do is still tweak certain things. And as and when I tweak things, there's that like deeper sense of intuition that's always gauging whether this is something that's worth retaining, or is this something that I have to change? Is this something I have to, like tweak a little bit? So that has been sort of like the anchor point that has got me to where I am and is also helping me, like refine this further.
I love that you're in tune with intuition. I think that's something that we all have, it's our innate ability, but I think especially in Western cultures, I think more so, and maybe because I live in Western cultures, right? It gets demonized quite a bit. I feel like we're very much more data and science and like wanting to know all of the details, right? And tracking everything, and as you mentioned, it's kind of come out like biohacking to track everything and stuff, and rather than actually just dropping into our bodies and actually how do I feel, and using that as the best, one of the tools that we actually have at our disposal to therefore make more conscious choices and stuff. And I also like the fact you mentioned consciousness, because I think that in order to live healthy lives, consciousness is such a huge part of that. And so, yeah, I don't think that we can live our best lives without consciousness ultimately, and that that feeds into the topic that obviously we're focusing on today of health. Do you have any like principles when it comes to health? So what I mean by that is, and I'll share kind of one of mine, again alluded to it there in terms of like ultra processed food, right? So like what and let me define principles a bit further as well, in terms of, because the space is so conflicted with different health advice, I try and focus on consensuses, truths that we actually most people can kind of agree on, right? So most people agree on that actually ultra processed foods, are bad, right? And so that's like one of my like core kind of principles, is to limit and or like not even go near that stuff, right? So what does that look like in day to day? I haven't been into a fast food restaurant for like 15 years, right? So like because I know that food is bad. Like, can we even call it food? That's probably a different conversation. There's a guy I follow called Sean Stevenson from the Model Health Show, who refers to it as like food-like products, right? So which I resonate with and stuff. But anyway, I'm going a bit off track. So I wanted to know, when you're navigating this information, obviously you're using your gut feel, intuition, which is great. I think we can all over time develop that innate capacity because it's within us.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any like general kind of, I don't want to call them rules, but like principles that you use to navigate, if it's the information or just kind of health in general?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So intuition is, like the aspect of the inward senses, or the introspective aspect of judging whether what is happening on the outer external senses is right for me or not. It has to always be paired with the right kind of tools, even on the external, to make sense of the world and, like we always have to look at the world through certain perspectives, and it is necessary to like have a certain perspective in order to make sense of something and navigate our way according to that. And of course, this perspective can keep changing over time, and that's the benefit of being introspective. Like, you go within, you can question the model that you're following and make any tweaks that are necessary, and then like you go out and test out this new found model that's there, or the updated model, and see how well that functions. So when it comes to that aspect of the model that I follow, it is always grounded in like the scientific data that is there, especially related to metabolism, cellular metabolism, and gut health. So these are two aspects that I believe are sort of like like the main pillars of what determines good health is. At least right now, that's like these are the two areas that I resort to. So coming first to this aspect of mitochondria, so every single cell of our body has this thing called mitochondria, which basically is responsible for the conversion of whatever you eat, the carbohydrates, especially in the form of glucose that goes in, and convert that into energy that is used in all the kinds of different cellular processes within the body. So the mitochondria basically is the powerhouse of the cell, and it determines the health of the entire cell. As long as the mitochondria is in good health, you can like be convinced that you're in good health. So your entire functionality is sort of dependent on the cellular metabolic function that happens within your body. So when it comes to understanding and like just a simple breakdown of how the processes within our own bodies work, almost everything we eat is composed of different macronutrients. So there are three major macronutrients: there's carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. So fats and proteins have their own pathways in which like that is not the core aspect that I'll be talking about today. What I'll mostly be talking about is the metabolism of carbohydrates. So within carbohydrates, there are three different types. There's fiber, there is complex carbohydrates in the form of starches, and there's simple carbohydrates, which is in the form of sugars. So the table sugar, the cane sugar, dates sugar, and even sugar that's there in fruits, which is in the form of fructose, all of these are in the form of simple sugars. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong about simple sugars, but we have to understand the way they like are utilized by our mitochondria, the way they are utilized by our body, and make informed choices with regard to that. Now, we as humans never had to pay so much attention to our health or our attention to like cellular metabolism to this extent 100 or 200 years ago. Like back when like we used to have most of our produce naturally grown and unprocessed, whenever we like found berries or fruits or anything that tasted sweet, it was a cue to accumulate as much of that as possible. We would like we would love like coming across a bush that had a lot of berries, and we would feast on that without like taking care of like what the consequences will be, or without wondering about any of that. And all of that is mostly because nature sort of regulated our health to a large degree. The thing that changed after processing is that we found a way to like whenever these foods had certain kinds of sugars, we were not consuming the sugar with the bulk of the rest of the nutrients in the food. We were just consuming sugar in its pure form, and we would concentrate it, add it to cereals, add it to like different kinds of premixes, add it to canned food, add it to almost everything, because that like gave us that kick to consume more of it. So back when most of our food was unprocessed, finding sugar in natural food was very scarce. Like in natural produce, like the amount of sugar is much lower compared to the like the nutrients and fiber and all the other things that exist. So even if we did overindulge in any of the produce that we found, we would stop by like having our fiber intake fulfilled or having most of the other nutrients that were satisfied. But now what happens once we process and isolate sugar, most of the products that we put sugar into have empty calories. Like they basically don't have any nutrients. So fast food restaurants, Coke, and like all the soda and sugary drinks, they don't have any nutritional benefit, but they have a ton of sugar. And it has a like a deep seated biological drive where sugar like releases huge amounts of dopamine, convinces the body to like keep indulging until it fulfills whatever nutrients it needs to fulfill. But the sad part is the body keeps craving for these foods without ever meeting the nutritional like any of the nutritional needs that are there. And it just like sends the body into this vicious cycle where you're just tempted to keep eating all the time and in a sense be unsatisfied or dissatisfied with the kind of food that you're eating. So it like brings you into this kind of roller coaster where your mood just keeps fluctuating, and that has deeper reasonings because your entire physiology is built around limiting or like ensuring that there's a steady level of glucose present in your bloodstream. It should not spike nor should it dip too much. Like the whole aspect of like in a sense, for the majority of people, if you want to measure whether they're healthy, if you look at their like these two metrics called fasting blood glucose and fasting triglycerides, you can get a pretty good picture of how healthy they are. So by fasting, like if you're not eaten in a span of let's say 10 to 12 hours and your fasting blood glucose is anywhere in the range of like 70 to 90, it's an indication that you're like quite stable. If it's higher, let's say 150, 160, it's an indication that there's a lot of sugar running through your bloodstream. So the reason sugar like plays such an important role is because mitochondria need sugar to produce energy. So when we think about it from like let's say a conventional or classical scientific worldview, if you give your body an abundance of sugar, shouldn't it be giving you an abundant output of energy? Like that seems like the common sense narrative, but the truth is biology is not that simple. The body isn't just like manufactured in a way that says you have this much input so you get that much output. So I think one of the things that happened after our industrial revolution was the feeling that like the amount of raw materials that you put in becomes the amount of raw materials you get out, and the more raw materials you get out, the more profitable the thing is, whatever produce you're selling. So ultimately it should be good, but that's not what the wisdom of the body is like the wisdom of the body goes in regulation. It doesn't like excess. So mitochondria have a limit based on which like how well they can metabolize sugar into energy. When we consume any of the processed foods or ultra processed foods or foods that have a ton of simple sugars in them, it overburdens the mitochondria so much that it like our entire bloodstream gets saturated with sugar, and the muscles, tissues, every single cell in the body basically need this glucose to like create energy. But what happens is it becomes like a traffic jam. There's so much sugar present that the mitochondria just say, hey, wait, like I don't know how to function at this pace. Like I know that I need sugar to metabolize, this is important for me, but this is overload. Like I'm being overburdened with the amount of work that I need to do. So in order to like ensure that the functioning happens smoothly, the mitochondria won't take in all that glucose, and the bloodstream like is like the body's indication is basically that hey, glucose like sticks in the bloodstream and it can cause different blockages, too dangerous to have it in the bloodstream, so we need to push it into the cells no matter what. So when that happens, the pancreas basically secretes this hormone called insulin, which goes and binds with different cells and basically says, I know you're overstuffed with glucose, but please take more in because the bloodstream is saturated and there's just too much sugar over there. And the moment that happens, like the cells have to comply and they have to let it in. There is a point to which like this interplay of insulin and glucose and metabolism can happen, but the mitochondria are still overburdened and they've like stored the excess amount of glucose in the form of fat, and that is what like leads to obesity, leads to excess body fat, and like that's basically the way in which the body is trying to regulate itself. So the body has no mechanism of simply eliminating something that's in excess, because we like came from the forest and came from an ecosystem where food was scarce, we had to make use of every tiny thing that we get. So the entire process that's involved is basically that no matter how much glucose comes in, we'll store everything as fat and we'll ensure nothing goes to waste. But the problem that happens is that there's just so much overload of sugar that even after obesity, we, like keep consuming ultra processed foods. It's basically giving more and more resources to the body that it just can't handle. So some of the data actually suggests that, like the mitochondria are asked to work around 700 to 1,000 times more than our usual pace. So you can get a rough estimate about just how much food that we are actually giving in the form of simple sugars.
Mm.
So now, like there is this interplay of insulin that's, like secreting and telling the body to store more sugar as fat, but that can't keep going on forever. So the pancreas gives up, and then, like the cells basically stop responding to the increased insulin levels. And that is when, like people are usually considered to be insulin resistant at that stage. Basically saying that, like even though there's a lot of insulin that the pancreas is secreting, the cells of the body are not listening. Like it's almost as if they've gone into this rebel mode where they're like, I'm no longer going to comply with you. I don't care what you do with that sugar, but it's not coming in my cell anymore. So this is the stage where, like a lot of dangerous things start happening, where the sugar starts attaching to different kinds of like red blood cells. It starts accumulating in the blood vessels. It starts to develop more of the bad cholesterol that's there in our blood. So all of these kinds of imbalances start happening. And the consequences of all of this is that whenever the mitochondria is, like signaling stress, it's signaling its overburden. And whenever the free sugar molecules going around and creating blockages, the body's immune response is called into action. So the immune cells go and they're basically like, hey, we need to clean this area up. We need to ensure that, like the blood vessels are clean, like any wounds that have happened are healed, and like, nothing should be going wrong within the systems of the body. So whenever the whenever the white blood cells or the inflammation, the immune response is kicked in, there's different kinds of inflammatory response that kicks in. And inflammation usually shows up as a symptom in the form of pain, in the symptom of rashes or skin allergies, in the, like in the way in which any organ of our body isn't functioning the way it should. So basically, all of the things that we run to the doctor for uh, are symptoms which are indications of some kind of inflammatory response. And most of our medical system is designed to, like address this particular symptom and design drugs that will go and numb the inflammatory response. So basically saying there's a lot of these white blood cells or the immune response that's there. How do we, like go in there and shut that down? Or if they're signaling some kind of pain, how do we make sure it stops, like sending out that particular chemical molecule that actually is perceived by the body as pain? So a lot of work can go in to, like in the form of trying to mitigate our sense of the symptoms, or give us this temporary relief of freedom from the symptoms. But the underlying cause is always that of overburdening our body with excessive calories in the form of sugar, in the form of ultra processed food. And this, like you can sort of say for a good portion of the population that this is the reason why so many of us are sick today. I wouldn't say that this is the reason for every single thing. Of course, like people will have to go to the doctor and ensure that that truly is the reason or not. But you can take it, like with the current cultural nutritional trends, that most of our diseases are caused by this interplay of excessive sugar. And that is one aspect. The other aspect is we are not getting enough of the necessary micronutrients that are needed. So there's B vitamins, the family of B vitamins, vitamin D, there are trace minerals, there's, like a lot of like magnesium, calcium, and all of these tiny trace elemental things that we need, elemental minerals and all of these things that we need, which are also playing a crucial role in so many of the different cellular metabolic processes. So the reason for that is largely due to, like the soil health and all that, which we can touch up later on. But let's, like just talking about health and the perspective about health, which is still vast. It comes to this aspect of cellular metabolism.
And I guess so. It sounds like your main prism of kind of looking after your health is optimizing for. I don't even like using the word optimizing, to be honest, but it is kind of focusing on managing. I get it. Kind of sounds like your energy and your mitochondria, because well, that gives you energy, right? Like at the end of the day, kind of in that you answered like pretty much all my next questions, because one of my next question was what are the downstream effects of this, and obviously that as well. Obviously you refer to inflammation, etc. So thank you for kind of walking us through that. Let's actually touch on how you kind of finished there in terms of all of the other minerals, trace minerals, etc. as well, because I think especially within gym culture, maybe Western culture, we kind of understand that we have fat, carbohydrates, and protein. Although one thing I did kind of want to mention is that, and you said it there, is that when we have excess simple sugars, it stores as fat. Where actually, I think previously, like the belief was, fat was seen as the bad guy, right? And like there was like this notion of like if you eat fat, then you get fat, but dietary fat is different than fat kind of on our bodies, which is interesting, and I think something that I've learned and picked up on. I was like, oh wow, and it's actually as you said, I'm just kind of like repeating and kind of preaching here that it's the excess sugar. But I think that one thing is, and maybe people becoming more conscious of it, but like everything else, right? Like these minerals, these vitamins, these compounds, etc., that don't get spoken about as much as like the big three, right? As we kind of said there, fat, carbohydrates, protein, and I'm guessing that like thousands of years ago when we were kind of in our tribes, etc., we would have found these within the foods that we were eating. So the berries, etc., and our soil and just the environment was much different. So we were getting adequate kind of amounts. Over time, our soil has gone through a process of degeneration. Basically, it's not, and there's not the vitamins, etc., in our foods that there once was. So I'm guessing that's where permaculture comes in. So talk to us about what you've learned and how you've then implemented what you've learned in this area of everything else within our foods, and not necessarily the big three when it comes to health, and actually why that's so important, because a lot of these minerals and compounds and vitamins actually have major roles to play in our biological understanding of the body. And like as I've dived into this some more, I've kind of come to my own conclusion that actually we're like biological beings, right? Like there's so many of these different compounds and stuff that play so many different roles that we're just not conscious of, we're not taught it, we're not aware of it, but then actually they play a role in the symptoms that we experience, right? Like the tiredness, like the dry skin, or like whatever it is. So I'll hand back over to you, my friend. But yeah, like talk us through what you've learned in terms of the vitamins, the minerals, how that links into permaculture, because obviously it does, soil, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question, which like forms that bridge that I love to talk about between the human health and the soil health. So when like you look back into, as you mentioned, when we were in our tribes, like there was no mineral or vitamin deficiencies that we were suffering from. Now, a lot of this has to do with the kind of food we used to eat and also where it was grown. Now, the reason this aspect of soil becomes so crucial when we talk about this particular aspect of all the micronutrients, and I would also add to that this thing called antioxidants, which also have like a very powerful role to play in our body. So these are things that we don't, like it's not the main concept that most of the nutritional debates are about these days. It's still about, like getting the adequate amount of protein met and limiting carbohydrates, eating more fiber. So that seems to be the larger part of what the talks are about. But this is the most crucial aspect. So when again we talk about like metabolism and this aspect of mitochondrial health, so many of the tiny processes that have to happen within the mitochondrial function rely almost solely on these minerals and vitamins. So these play the roles of, like creating the structures that transport different proteins from one area to another. They're basically sort of like, like play an important role in creating structures that carry forth nutrients from one area to another, or ensuring that, like the entire process that is needed in conversion of the food we eat into the byproduct that the body needs to function, like all of these things happen smoothly, is controlled by the trace minerals. The reason why the food we have today is so depleted in this is largely related to commercial farming and the commercial, like the way in which we focus on agriculture. So if you think about how most of the things we consume are farmed today, there are just a handful of grains like wheat, rice, and like I think these are the two main sort of grains that are there. And there are a few other categories of foods that we eat, and like I think in the West most of it is like meat dominated. So in order to produce more meat, which is in the form of factory farms, they grow a lot of corn and soya. So soy has like a lot of fiber and protein which goes into animal feed, and the animals are fed these crops, and later they're like butchered, and the meat is sold as the like the dominant nutritional or the dominant aspect of what people consume. So if you look at
Yeah,
what is
especially yeah,
mostly commercially, yeah, as protein. So if you look at what is commercially produced, it is corn, soy, wheat, and rice. So I like these are more or less the majority of the grains that are produced. And in order to produce them, uh, if you look at the images of like farms today, the industrialized farms, most of these are flat lands which have these large machines which go and like till the soil and sow the seeds and grow these crops and harvest and all of these things. It's largely done by machines, and done by machines especially on flat land. So a lot of agriculture previously used to rely on nature, the climate, the kind of, like interplay that used to happen between different seasons and how the grains were grown. And it was more hands on where people used to, like, they had a very intimate knowledge about what grows well, where, what grows well with what. Like all of that system has been replaced with this monocultural farming technique where a single crop has to be grown. And in order to grow that, you basically flatten out a large area of the land. And the first thing that is done after flattening is tilling the soil. So, tilling is a way in which they loosen the upper part of the soil. And the moment, like that aspect happens where the soil is rotated on the top layer of the soil is rotated, most of the bacteria and the microbes reside in that particular layer. Most of where like the growth for the plants come from like those top few layers of the soil, which just go up to like a few inches deep, which is the most nutritious layer and the most important layer for any plant while it is growing. The moment people till the land, they basically rotate out all the bacteria and microbes that used to live in a very moist and sheltered, dark environment and expose it out into the sun, where the bacteria just cannot survive, where none of the microbes can survive. The heat of the sun just bakes them out and they die. When they die, whenever, like people start to sow whatever grain they wish to cultivate, most of the life that is actually involved in the interaction between the plant, the root system, and the nutrients that lay within the soil, like that bridge is lost. So the way, like plants actually grow is that most of the soil, like almost any soil, you go all over the world, every piece of soil has all the nutrients that are necessary for the plant's growth. The problem is the nutrients become bioavailable, meaning like the nutrients take a form which the plant can utilize only if there is life in the form of microbes present in the soil. So there are these, like bacteria, arthropods, nematodes, fungi, and all of these different organisms which have their own interplay. Like each of them eat the other, they move up and down the soil, they, like stick to different surfaces, they have their own kind of drama that's unfolding within the soil. And this interplay where one, like organism eats the other and moves to a different place and eats another one, this is basically involved in transporting all these micronutrients from the different layers of the soil, bring it up to the part where the root and the microorganisms around the root are present. They take part in that, like interaction, and all the microbes love sticking to the roots of any plant because, like whenever there's heavy rainfall or downpour of water, the roots are always stable. So the bacteria and all the other microorganisms that stick to the roots are basically having this safe shelter where they're like, hey plant, like, like I will stick to you and I will do a very crucial thing, like in order to have your shelter, which is that whenever I come across nutrients that I, like eat from other microorganisms, I'll convert these things into a form that you like so that I can transport it onto you and you can keep growing and, like encouraging your roots so that I have more and more safety. So this is the interplay between any crop, any plant that is growing and the microbe and the life that is there within the soil. The moment we, like have this upturning of the soil, most of the microorganisms die. And then when people plant something, they see that the plant is not growing. Now, whenever they notice that the plant is not growing, they can do, like a lot of soil testing and all of these things, and they'll be like, okay, like this is lacking in nitrogen and phosphorus, which are very important, like molecules for the plant to grow. And they basically package this particular, like concentrated fertilizer, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and just dump it onto the soil. And they, like do it because they're like, the soil doesn't have enough nutrients. The problem is not that the soil doesn't have nutrients. The problem is the nutrients are not being converted into a bioavailable form for the plant in order for them to grow. So if people actually, like paid attention to the life and the microbial diversity and help them thrive, the necessary transactions that need to happen in order to form these micronutrients, including nitrogen and phosphorus, they happen in the way that the plant can take it up and grow. But the moment, like we see that something's lacking, and most of the commercial agricultural perspective is that of making profit, they dump a lot of this, which, like just settles in the soil, and very tiny amount of it is taken up by the plant. It grows, it's cultivated, and then this particular process of upturning the soil and all of these things happen again and again. Most of the nitrogen, phosphorus, all of these things stay there. When the rains come, they wash it away, and like they further, like pollute the entire atmosphere over there because there's certain nutrients that are in excess of what is needed by the soil over there, which stops the growth of many different kinds of organisms and encourage the kind of growth of a lot of different kinds of organisms that are not beneficial. It leads to a lot of imbalances. The moment these imbalances happen, like you get a lot of weeds that start cropping up in the field. And the moment weeds come up, what is the next thing they do? They're like, oh, there are weeds, they're taking away all the nutrients that we put for our main crop. So we need to, like take an, what is that, a weedicide, and just spray it all around so that the weeds die. So that is the second level at which, like we are polluting the soil. Once that is done, most of the, like the crops that are grown in a monoculture way are not really resilient. Like they're very weak because they don't have any diverse ecosystem protecting them. In a forest, if you look at a forest, like you never see monoculture or monocropping done in a forest. Why? Because that is the weakest form of agricultural technique. The moment you have monoculture, all of the things are uniform. The kind of bacteria in the soil are uniform. The kind of like insects that are attracted to the plants are uniform. And when all of these things happen, a slight imbalance and there's some kind of pest that comes and attacks all of them. So it starts from like one particular crop which gets diseased. It can get a fungal infection. It can get some like particular pest that likes to feed on the fruit of it, and it starts sitting on that, and it basically looks at this huge landscape, and it's like, oh, like this is my paradise. Like I get the kind of food I need in abundance. So they start multiplying and they start eating most of the things. The moment that happens, they're like, okay, like let's bring in this insecticide to ensure we kill all of the pests. The moment they do that, again, like the insecticide doesn't just kill the bad guys, it kills the good guys too. Most of the bugs, the bees, and all the diverse interactions that are needed just deplete. So on these three levels, in the form of synthetic fertilizers, in the form of weedicides and pesticides, most of the like the chemicals are leaching into the soil and damaging and further depriving the soil of all the nutrients that, not just nutrients, sorry, the microbes and the life that is there. And the moment that happens, the soil, basically the quality of the soil keeps going down and down and down. And over a period of time, it reaches a point where the soil just gives up. Like there's no more life in the soil. So when that happens, like all of the produce, and not just when that happens, like all of the produce that goes in the timeline of that are basically getting few of the nutrients that are needed in order for the plant to flourish and seem like it has a huge yield. It can have a big size, it can have the necessary nutrients in the form of fiber and protein. But overall, because the microorganisms are lacking, the tiny necessary vitamins and minerals are not even being produced and taken up by these plants, which are then like consumed by us or given to the animals in the factory farms, where none of them are actually truly getting all of the nutrients that are needed. And in this entire food web, we basically get this imbalance where the uptake is just of the three macronutrients or some superficial way in which we measure what is needed in terms of nutrients, whereas the bulk of the necessary compounds get left behind within the soil, or not. Most of them are not even formed because there's not enough life to bring them into the right chemical structure.
So many things there. And one thing that really stands out to me when we talk about all this stuff is around the downstream effects, right? So like my mind goes to, okay, like it's one thing, the soil and then the plant would then, and then the fruit from the plant doesn't have the nutrients, the compounds, etc., that we need in order to thrive. Then actually, because we're spraying all of this, for one of a better word, shit on on everything, like that's soaking into like the soil, right? So that is a byproduct, is part of the plant, is part of the food that we're consuming, and so like that's in our bodies, right? Like I wouldn't go to a supermarket, get a weed killer and just drink it, right? So like why on earth would we
Yes.
pour it on the land? This then it becomes part of our food ultimately. And so this is where in a way I think it links back up to the kind of, in a bit, like we at the beginning spoke about consciousness, right? Like we're just not conscious of these things. It's just not something that we consciously think about. And so we're just kind of going around our lives just like blindly, ultimately just kind of accepting how things are, but then have all these symptoms um and to be honest, a lot of these things over time, when we expose ourselves to them, are going to lead to chronic diseases, that we experience in our always, continuously on the rise, but we don't make that connection, because we're not living consciously, for the people that are, sometimes they might get kind of cancelled or whatever the correct kind of term is these days. And yeah, it's just not something ultimately that I think that in the status quo, in the main system we're talking about, because like, why is that? Because if we did, it would affect the big food companies' bottom line at the end of the day. Like, let's not beat around the bush type of things. So in terms of that, kind of some things that I would love to talk about and finish on is around how is permaculture therefore different? So what's the approach of permaculture compared to what we're currently doing, the traditional way of things? I love some of the things you mentioned around like different seasons, etc. Because that's something that I 100% need to do better at and want to do better at, is in terms of eating with the seasons and going with the seasons. I'm not a master at any of these things, and that's one thing that I'm definitely not. But it's something that I'm conscious of, because like like thousands of years ago, let's just take wheat for example. Okay, like maybe that season was between this month and this month, where now, as you said, because it's so standardized, because we use it in kind of like everything, like that also is part of the problem, I guess. But anyway, I'm kind of waffling. So permaculture, like, how is that different? What's that process? And how's that different to how we're currently doing things in like the standardized way?
Permaculture um, is basically a system through which you relate to the soil, food, and the human economics around food and sharing resources. So most of this is basically a study of, like the ways in which the tribal societies of the past used to live, the way they used to tend to the soil, the way they used to tend to the food they grow, and the way they used to share the resources that are grown. And basically the origins of permaculture, like permaculture stands for permanent agriculture or permanent culture. So in a sense, it has, the aspect emphasis on the word permanent, because it's basically saying the relationship you have with the earth is sort of like a permanent one. Once you start, like living with the soil, it's a permanent and necessary relationship, because that's the foundation of everything. Your whole life depends on that. And the emphasis on the word culture is basically the kind of organizing that happens, the organizing between how the humans tend to the soil, what we feed the soil, and what we reap out of the soil, the interaction or the culture we have amongst ourselves as humans, the way, like it also involves this aspect of economics and how we share resources, and the kind of emphasis we lay on the biodiversity and the thriving of life, not just for the humans, but for all life, in the form of insects, the bees that are there, the pollinators, the soil, the microorganisms, the plants, the trees, everything. This whole area of permaculture was something that originated by this guy called Bill Mollison from Australia, who basically, with a colleague of his, studied various tribal cultures, which still, like practiced this way of farming. I think this was in the 1960s or so, and basically found certain similarities between all of these different traditional systems. So he went to Africa, India, like the Red Indians in the Americas, South America, like various areas of the world, studied the way the ancient people used to tend to the soil and, like basically have their culture surrounding food, and condensed them into these 12 distinct principles, which basically are a guiding or like a tool or a compass through which anyone who wants to rebuild the relationship to the soil or practice some form of regenerative agriculture can follow these principles as a way of relating to the unique landscape that they are working on, and try to, like bring back and revive that kind of culture that used to be there before the industrialization happened. So one of the things that permaculture lays a lot of emphasis on is the regeneration of life from the areas where it's already barren right now. And once it is regenerated, to keep it thriving in that.
So sorry to interrupt. Yeah, because I was wondering, like, once like an area, let's just take a field, etc. Let's just say it's been gone through like the standard process. I was actually kind of wondering if it can ever go back to, let's use the word thriving, right, with diversity and bugs and kind of etc. So it sounds like through the permaculture method, it can. So that gives hope to people. Yeah, that's a question that I had. But sorry for interrupting. Like, continue on that. So basically, it can go back to kind of once what it was, and then through permaculture, one of the principles is then for for it to stay thriving ultimately. It sounds like.
So this is again, like the aspect where the perma or the permanent aspect comes in, which is where, like you revive the soil and try to keep it that way for a permanent way or for a permanent timeline. So it is possible to bring back barren soil. There are a lot of people who have successfully done that. The only thing is it takes quite a bit of time until it comes to the point where it's thriving. So in a sense, you can correlate this with human health as well. No matter how sick someone is, it is always possible for them to, like get back to good, healthy practices and change their lifestyle and bring back a sense of good health. But it's still a lot of time and consistency that will bring them back to the point where they can thrive. So it's a very similar thing that happens with the soil. The ecosystems that have been degraded can be rebuilt, can be revived, they all can be regenerated, but they also need a lot of time and patience in order to, like ensure that they come to that. Yeah. So most of, like the simple perspective or some of the simple aspects of what is necessary for permaculture is that surrounding water, mostly related to water, because water is basically the thing that gives life to all the
I'm not sure if you've heard of that saying. It's like so it goes from like where there is water, there is life. Anyway, sorry, I'm kind of
Yes.
interrupting there. But yeah, like
No, that's
continue, and I would love to maybe actually it would be most valuable that not necessarily to dive into each of the 12 principles, but just kind of quickly state kind of what they are within permaculture. Obviously, after finishing
sure.
after finishing your thought, I interrupted again. But yeah, this fascinates me, so hence I kind of keep jumping in. But please,
Sure.
please continue your thought, and then yeah, if you can, just kind of state the 12 principles, because I would recommend people, and I'll link resources down below in the show notes and on additional resources on the site. Where people can learn more about this, because I think like we could probably go for a whole day kind of learning about permaculture, right?
Yeah.
It sounds like one of those topics, but yeah, please continue your thought I interrupted with, and then if you can state the 12 principles, I think that would be helpful for people.
Sure. So I don't like recall all the 12 principles in my mind right now, but I can just about, like talk about some of the aspects that I remember and just give a picture of it. Maybe I'll share a link to you about, like something relates to all the 12 principles that the viewers can redirect to. But simply put, one of the things that it has to do is with capturing energy in the form of water, energy in the form of sunlight, energy in the form of wind, and like whatever is possible, anything that brings forth energy as a means of sustaining and building life. You design the land that you're implementing permaculture in such a way that it brings forth as much energies as possible and stores as much as possible as well. So for example, if we consider water, you can design, like earthworks, like you can dig trenches, you can create swales, you can create trenches and bunds and a lot of different things to ensure that water does not flow very quickly, because once the water starts flowing quickly, it takes away all the soil and the microbes. So to ensure that the flow of water is slow, the water spreads as much as possible throughout the land and also percolates and settles into the soil. And once that is done, it's not evaporated, it's not lost. So one of the most common techniques to do that is to mulch. So you have dried leaves or, like anything that basically creates a barrier on the top layer of the soil, which ensures that the entire layer that has the moisture and the microbes stay protected from the sun or from the wind or from any kind of things that might take it away. So there is that. The other emphasis is on this aspect of biodiversity, like getting in, encouraging various different kinds of things to grow, encouraging different kinds of relationships to be built in the form of, like microbes, insects, in the form of trees or crops or anything that's growing. So there's a lot more diversity, which builds more resilience in the form of, like if there's no one single pest that can grow as much as it wants. It has its own limitations, because if there is, let's say, a pest that loves a mango tree, in order to jump to another mango tree, if it has a barrier of 2 or 3 other different trees, which it does not like, it cannot go and spread its disease elsewhere. It's localized to this one region. And the moment it is localized, like it can't breed its population into excess. It's naturally limited. And the existence of diversity also encourages different kinds of organisms or insects that can come and actually attack this pest. Because in nature, like everything is everything else's food. So there's one insect that likes to eat this mango, and probably, like if it goes in imbalance, it might spoil the entire tree. But there are also so many other insects and birds and all these things that like to eat this little worm or this little insect or pest. So it comes to attack this. So the entire system is sort of always kept in balance. So there are the principles are basically utilized as a means by which you understand how to quickly bring back the soil to its optimum level. And the moment you bring it that way to that stage, you can keep preserving it. And most of the time, like you do mostly nothing, like in the sense that you're not going and, like constantly working on the land or anything. There are things to do in seasonal wise in terms of, like when you harvest, when you sow, and all of these things. But most of the aspects regarding earthworks or like regarding digging and all of these things are not necessarily done to a great extent. It's usually done to a minimum so that you don't disturb the soil too much. And when you let an ecosystem just let it be for long durations of time, that is when the changes and the miracle really starts to happen. It is really letting things be and take their own time, which actually encourages the building of different ecosystems. And it also, like permaculture also emphasizes native species and local and seasonal variants that are supposed to grow in a particular region. Because any local plant or any native plant, like the plant that is native to that particular region, grew with the particular kind of microbes and the kind of diversity and the kind of composition in the soil that was there for millions of years. So because these guys, like have withstood floods, droughts, like all kinds of different climatic adversities, they're naturally resilient to so many of these factors. So many of the native species are naturally resilient, and they don't take up a lot of resources, they don't take up a lot of water, and they also know how to produce a bountiful yield. And when people create a diversity of this form, they're not just relying on one particular crop to satisfy their demands. It comes in a place of self fulfillment where the people or the family that is there always in contact with the soil and the environment first meet their own needs, become self sufficient, and the excess produce can then be shared with all the other people around them. And this is also the way, like the traditional farming systems used to happen. So that in a sense is mostly what permaculture is about.
Amazing. Thank you for walking us through that. Fascinating stuff. The question I have to finish is, like, everything that we've discussed and covered is great. How do we go about applying it? Like, how do we take everything that we've learned today and apply it? So, two questions for you. First of which is, what are 3 things that we can do on a personal level? So 3 things that we can do on a personal level, kind of an action or something that we can do, and then 3 things that we can do on like a societal level, because it sounds like, especially when we're talking more about kind of farming, etc., that's probably more of a top level thing. Like I don't live on a farm. I'm not a farmer. There are farms around where I live, although I live on hills and stuff, so it's not like dead flat. But there is the same grain or the same plant. Here in the where I live, like there's the horrible stuff of like rapeseed oil plants, or like rapeseed, and then they like squeeze the rapeseed to get the oil, which is bad stuff. But anyway, 3 things that we can do on a personal level, and then 3 things that we can do on a societal level.
Okay, so coming to the 3 things we can do on a personal level: reconnect with nature, and it can be done in simple ways of spending more time outdoors, getting in more sunlight, especially right when you wake up in the morning and during sunset. Like these are the golden hours. And try to, like visit or spend some time in any form of natural ecosystems that might be there, accessible to you in the form of forests or anything that is untouched or very little adulterated by humans. So spending some time with that. Another free thing would be to reduce or completely eliminate the intake of ultra processed foods and refined sugars and refined flours or anything that is industrialized. So to whatever extent possible, limit the consumption of these things or eliminate them. And coming to free things we can do on a more societal level, you can think about like supporting local farmers. Go and like just look at like I'm pretty sure every region will have some or the other form of local markets that might happen weekly or monthly. So try to go there, connect with the farmers who are growing food for you. So become more like conscious about where your food is coming from and who is growing your food. If you get a chance, visit a farm where food is grown, or if you have a garden, grow anything on your own, even if it's just a simple herb or a tiny plant. Like just grow and like consume it on your own. Like it could be as simple as a basil plant. So you reconnect with the joy of like growing and consuming something on your own, and that has a different kind of connection that builds between you and the soil. So that, and I would say just become more kind and compassionate and understanding of the world around you, understanding of the people around you, and try to connect and form a community with more of the people who are doing these regenerative practices.
Quick question on the farming aspect. So I've understood more the importance of trying to connect with local farmers and local markets, etc. Not just from our conversation today, but throughout my own kind of health journey, etc. One question I have though, so from in my naivete maybe, how I understand the system kind of works here in the UK is that we do have farmers, etc. And they typically don't get paid kind of probably what they're worth by the big supermarkets, etc. So if we, let's just say, ditch the middleman, which is most time the supermarket, and go straight to the farmer, are they still using what you shared beforehand in terms of the big machinery? And if so, like that still has an impact, right, on not just permaculture, but probably our health as well. So is there also therefore farmers out there? I'm sure there is, the world's a big place, there's 8 billion people. I'm not sure how many farmers, but anyway, are there farmers who still do things in more of a way that is how things have traditionally been done from ancient kind of, not ancient times, but that don't use these big kind of machinery, or maybe that they don't use all of the different chemicals, which then brought something to my mind around like organic produce, right? Because people are like, well, buy organic, and then there's some go back to the overload of health information, and some people are like, well, actually organic is not as good as we think it is, but actually it's better than non-organic, basically. So what's your quick take on that? Because if we are ditching the middleman, but the farmer is still using like big machinery, etc., the chemicals, that's still going to have an impact, right? So is it also then about finding the right farmer. And that's why then going to these markets are also important, because we can have those conversations. I'm just kind of understanding that part.
Okay, that's a great question to ask. And the response to that, I would say, is when we think about industrial agriculture, most of the produce that's produced, like most of the crops that are grown, have this kind of, like factory farming structure where the moment they're harvested, they don't go to any local farmer so that they can sell it on their own. It goes straight to a different factory where it's processed. Then it's, like the byproducts go to a different industry where this company makes a profit, and the thing that is actually supposed to go to the market gets directly branded and packaged under this particular company or different companies, and it just ends up directly in the supermarket. So it goes straight from the farm where it's grown and directly into the supermarket through the factories. So most of the produce that you see in supermarkets might not be coming from small farmers. It might just come from these larger companies who are, like processing these things and directly selling them. So when it comes to smaller farmers, like they don't have the amount of money to invest in these large scale machineries and sell the produce at a profitable rate. So for them, most of the time, the profitability lies in investing as little, like synthetic chemicals or any form of pesticides or anything to minimize the amount they use. Like I wouldn't say most of them don't use it at all. I'm pretty sure they use it too, but not to the extent where the industrial process, like industries use it, industrial agriculture uses it. And their incentive, like the small local farmers' incentive, is to stick with local regional crops, what is already in abundance, try to grow them and just try to sell them as quickly and freshly as possible. So most of the time, like the produce that they grow and sell is not even kept in some, like processed unit in a particular warehouse until the time comes where they can, meet people's demands. If they have to sell something, they probably immediately, like take it from the farm, process it to whatever degree is necessary, in the sense of, like packaging it in a way it is handy, or just like cleaning the particular crop to whatever extent is necessary, and then immediately sell it out. So most of them don't have the resources to invest in big machinery and dumping a lot of chemicals. So to a large extent it is better comparatively, but even then you can go the extra mile and connect with different farmers. If they allow, you can try to go to their farms, see how they grow things, and stick to a particular farmer that you are comfortable with. So that way, like more people are actually connecting more with the farmers and understanding their way of life.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you for that, Rohan. Thank you for today. It's been fascinating conversation. I've definitely learned a lot, and I felt like, especially on the permaculture, there are different elements and things that we haven't necessarily touched upon, but I think it's given people a good understanding of it. I had questions around like, well, how does then climate change affect kind of how we're growing our crops and kind of food and stuff, and these kind of other little subsections that I think all have an impact, right? Because it's all part of the ecosystem, it's all part of life itself and stuff. But I think that especially with the recommendations you gave on the 3 things that people can do, 3 things from a societal level, will be really impactful. So thank you for joining me today. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was a wonderful time talking to you.
I hope that you've enjoyed my conversation with my good buddy Rohan in this episode of the podcast. As I hope that you've now experienced, Rohan is a very deep thinker and someone who I respect tremendously, and is ultimately a good friend of mine. And I respect his dedication to exploring all really facets of self-improvement, whether that is health, what we've mostly focused on in this episode of the podcast, or spiritual matters, or other areas of self-improvement. Now, I alluded to it in the intro of this episode that I actually connected with Rohan through a platform called Mindvalley, which is the #1 personal transformation program in the world. And I would highly advise that you check out Mind Valley for yourself if you want to connect with your tribe. Deep thinkers, people who are passionate not only about health, but about self-improvement and becoming the best versions of themselves. You basically get to meet people like Rohan. And as hopefully, again, you've experienced in this episode, that can only be a positive as people like Rohan help you to be your best self. So without further ado, check out Mind Valley. There's a link in the show notes in the description of this podcast. Click on that link and you can head on over to Mind Valley and check that out. And yeah, when you join the Mind Valley platform, feel free to connect with me. They've got an amazing community over there. And I look forward to connecting with you on the Mind Valley platform or on social if you want to connect there instead. But yeah, thank you again for tuning into this episode. I hope that you've learned a lot from this episode exploring mitochondrial health, permaculture, and the food lands. Again, check out Mind Valley, check out all the links and mentions from this episode with Rohan, and I look forward to speaking with you, seeing you in the next